Welcome to the Walnut Hill Podcast, coming to you from beautiful Lexington, Kentucky. Each episode, we explore everyday topics through the lens of our walk with Jesus and what it means to live out our faith in real life. Today, we're talking about anger, as described by the Apostle to the Gentiles, Paul, in Ephesians Chapter 4. We're glad you're here, and we hope you enjoyed this lively conversation.
Well, good morning to you and hello. It is October the 6th, and welcome to Walnut Hill. My name is Sean Barkley. I'm the pastor at Walnut Hill Church, and I am here with my colleague, Jesse.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good.
I'm recovering. I'm recovering.
Can you tell our people at home what you're recovering from?
I'm recovering from yesterday, which was Sunday. Normally, it doesn't take a full day to recover from Sunday. It takes time.
Right.
But yesterday was the blessing of the animals up on Walnut Hill.
Yes, we had quite a few animals here.
Quite the crowd. We had some semi-aggressive animals.
We did have some animals that were a bit bothered. I have to say, Church Dog being one of them.
Church Dog was not on her best behavior.
No, she was barking and howling. I think she was just really trying to sing along.
She did a good job. She
Yeah.
certainly made her point.
She did.
She did, yeah. So, but it was a good day, and it's a little out of my comfort zone to do a blessing of the animals, but our folks seem to enjoy it. I enjoy it. You just never know what you're going to get with some of these animals.
You really don't. You never know how they're going to behave.
So we had that yesterday, and of course it was outdoor worship, which, if you're not familiar with Walnut Hill Church, it is just a gorgeous setting, in the middle of horse country and in the bluegrass. And did you see the horses were leaning over the fence during the service?
I didn't, but I love it. I think they were listening.
They were listening. I wondered if there was some kind of connection between the horses and all the dogs, that they were...
Maybe I
Oh.
just sensed all the animals being in the same space.
I have no idea. But anyway, that was kind of nice. A little bit of sunburn yesterday.
Yeah, the sun was right on you. I did see that.
But it was good. And then it was a little misaligned because everyone's happy. We've got our pets. And then we talk about anger.
Right.
My wife and I were talking, and she's like, maybe you could do it on a different day where it's not a worship service, because everyone's in a good mood. And then you say, I know everybody's angry about certain things right now.
It fit well for me because at that moment I was angry with the particular dog
Okay.
for barking. So for me it fit. I don't know, maybe other people there were feeling the same thing, but
Yeah. Well, so before we get into the biblical text, by the way, if you want to grab your Bible, we're in Ephesians Chapter 4. We began by talking about Hamilton, the musical.
yes.
You're smiling.
I love Hamilton. I mean, I probably know every word.
I have to confess,
Yes.
not a fan. In fact, so Amy Jo and I, and I'm not a huge musical guy anyway, because so much of the narrative and the dialogue is sung, yet not to any tune in particular. It's just sung. They're just outbursts of notes.
That's more opera, right?
Well, I've never been to the opera, so I
Oh,
wouldn't know.
yeah.
Nor have I been to the ballet.
Okay.
But we had a family who was visiting the church when I was a pastor up in Cincinnati, and family of 4 really sharp folks and a great addition to the church. And Hamilton was kind of the thing at that point. And Amy Jo and I just watched it on some kind of streaming service. And they were talking about it, and they asked me if I liked it. And I said, not particularly. They never came back.
No.
I mean, people got really invested in Hamilton.
They did. It was really a phenomenon.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was.
So it was not my thing. Now, the Jersey Boys, did you ever see the Jersey Boys?
I have heard of the Jersey Boys, but I have not.
Frankie Valli and
Yeah.
Oh, What a Night. So we love that. We saw that down in Charlotte. So anyway, started with Hamilton and just the whole Hamilton Burr feud.
Yes.
I almost led with the Hatfields and McCoys,
Oh, that would have been good
but
too.
decided to go because you and I had just been talking about hostility, and
Yeah.
you had mentioned, political hostilities from way back when.
Yes, we had talked about it. But I think this is a good one because it's, Hatfield and McCoys, I think you have that community build up to that anger.
Yeah.
But Burr and Hamilton, it was individual.
Yeah.
And I know they were involved in politics, so that makes it a bit bigger. But you're correct with Burr. It's just he couldn't get over it.
He could not let it go. He was the vice president of the United States.
Yeah,
And he challenges someone to a duel.
right.
And basically what they were saying was, this world is not big enough for the two of us.
Absolutely.
Which, have you ever had that experience in your life where you're like, I am so angry right now, life will not be good as long as this issue is not resolved or this person is around?
There's too many times to count.
Yeah.
I know. It is something that happens. And, we talked about simmering, and I do feel a simmering in our country.
Absolutely.
And of course, you turn up the heat, it boils over. You turn down the heat, it cools. And I just think as individual believers and as the church, I think turning people to Christ and turning people toward God has a natural cooling of anger, especially if it leads to sin. And we'll talk about that. Have you ever heard of intermittent explosive disorder?
No, but I can guess what it means.
Yeah. Wasn't that interesting? That study at Harvard from this past July, just 2 or 3 months old, found that nearly 10% of youth and adolescents
Right.
have this disorder. Or meet the criteria for that disorder.
And you said that disorder, it's kind of spurred on by social media use. That doesn't surprise me at all.
I think it is. Yep. Yeah, with social media, what I have been reading, of course, and it's not new news, is that there is a link between antisocial behavior, depression, anxiety, and adolescent suicide and heavy social media use.
Right.
Because of bullying. So and where does it all, where does it all go? I mean, where is all this leading us right now
I wonder
as a culture?
Yeah, all the time, especially with a 6-year-old. You kind of, I
Right.
mean, it's very scary.
Well, could it be that every generation like ours looks at the younger generation and says, the sky's falling, it's never going to recover? I mean, is there some truth to that, or are we in a season that is unlike any other?
I worry about it being that particular season because I also see that type of anger, and not necessarily from social media, but I am going to say cable network news.
Right.
I see that level of anger in older adults, and it kind of has the same effect as time spent on social media. I think time spent with cable news programs and on both sides.
Right.
I think there's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of hateful messages.
Name calling.
Yeah, and it makes people angry for the day. And think about it. Most people start their day off with the news.
Not me.
It sets you off on a bad path.
Well, it totally does. One of the redeeming qualities of our culture, as I look at it right now, is, do you know that Gen Z is attending worship more heavily than any other generation right now in terms of percentage?
Yeah.
Which is amazing to me, because the baby boomers after COVID, they really greatly reduced their church attendance
That's interesting.
and just assembling in general with groups.
Right.
And so, but Gen Z, they're going to church.
Good.
And so, I think there's a message in there somewhere that they are experiencing this anger and this hopelessness, and they're like, we got to do something redemptive about all this.
Right.
So we started out just talking about anger, and the reason I did was that Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, and again, we're in chapter 4, is writing about the new person and the new humanity. And in fact, the heading in the study Bible that I use was Rules for the New Life. And he begins, and we didn't do this yesterday, but he begins in verse 1 by just basically saying, here's what we're trying to do. Verse 1, quote, live a life worthy of your calling. In other words, you have been created new. You're in this new community. Live a life that's worthy of that. In verse 15, he goes on and says, grow up in every way. In other words, hey, it's time to start maturing. You can't spend your life in, and he says it in verse 17, futility with a darkened mind. So he begins this whole section by saying, hey, you've got a calling. You got to live a life that's worthy of that. And I think in the early church, there was some fear that people were receiving God's grace and enjoying that, and then thinking it has no bearing or consequence on the way that I live. Hey, I'm going to heaven. I can do whatever I want to do.
Right.
And Paul's basically saying, you can, but you should not want to any longer. God is going to change you. And have you ever in your life experienced a surprising change because of your relationship with God, where you're like, I don't feel this way anymore. I don't do this anymore. I don't think this anymore.
Yeah, I think it was touched upon yesterday because, and I don't want to fast forward too much, but a lot of what Paul is saying is the same thing we heard in like Psalm 141, my favorite psalm, which is, do not let my heart be drawn to what is evil. Don't let me take part in wicked deeds. And I feel like what Paul is saying and what's been said in Peter also is, give your worries to God. And you said it's not our job to pardon. That's God's work. And that has been so life-changing for me, because having the burden of judgment taken away and knowing someone else will handle that, that's not my job. I think that is transformative.
It has been for me. I mean, and it got in Romans 12, Paul writes, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." I mean, that's a quote from the Old Testament too. I think one of the lines from the sermon yesterday was, sometimes we feel like we have to take all of these burdens to bed with us. I've got to right every wrong. And sometimes we just have to go to sleep
Right.
and let God be God and hand that over to God. I felt like I was a little bit of an amateur armchair psychologist yesterday because I was thinking about just, first of all, the different types of anger. And really, this was just sort of my own experience. I think it's probably pretty universal. There is anger that's appropriate.
Yeah.
Faithful, redemptive anger. And then there's anger that's corrosive and destructive. And Paul acknowledges that in verse 26, if you've got your Bibles. He says, be angry, or writes, be angry, but do not sin. And as we grow closer to God, that does not mean we lose this emotion of anger. There is a righteous anger that we have. And of course, we looked at Matthew 21, where Jesus, he's so mad at the money changers in the temple, he literally takes a whip and drives them out.
Well, it sounded like he flipped tables.
He did.
Almost. I mean,
He absolutely did.
that mental image was a bit funny, but it made your point. I guess I'm questioning, though, apart from Jesus's righteous anger, what are some examples of righteous anger we might see today?
Well, I started to go into the story of the father whose 22-year-old was essentially executed by someone who had felonies upwards of 30,
Right.
who should not have been on the streets, a violent criminal, and for whatever reason had been permitted to not be incarcerated and permitted to walk the streets, literally broke into a house, did not know this young woman, and executed her. And the father was testifying, I believe it was before a city council in Charlotte, a city council meeting, and he was righteously angry. I mean, he had every right to be angry. And his anger was not like, I want you to, I'm going to slander you and I'm going to hurt you. His anger was, I think there needs to be something done here.
Right.
Now, that's an extreme example. But, if somebody were to bully your child, which, I used to have to deal with my own son, people would bully him at certain points of his life. I was angry and I intervened. And I think there's just times when you do that. Can you think of examples?
Yeah, I can. I always kind of recall this example. I think it broke in the news that a child who several reports had been made about to DCBS and some other authorities in the area, it went unheard. And the child eventually ended up dead. And I don't know if the anger is righteously placed on those entities, because you never know what side of the story they heard, or what report they got. But I think you can be angry for that child, that is the life he lived and something more couldn't be done for him.
Yeah, it's an appropriate emotion in certain cases. And then Paul goes on, but says, but do not sin. And I think that's so important. He acknowledges that we have this anger, this emotion, it's real, but it can also lead to sin. And of course, he will later talk about that sin. It's, it's bitterness, it's wrangling, which I love the word. Stop your wrangling, people. I love it.
Wrangling. Well, I have to go to bitterness, because you said in your sermon, bitterness ruins the vessel in which it is stored. And I loved that. I never thought of it that way.
That's one of my all-time favorite go-tos.
Where does that come from?
I don't know. I heard it years ago. And for me, that's been true, because I've been so angry at someone and so embittered, and that person had no idea. It was eating me alive, and they're fine.
Right.
And even if I had kind of poured my anger on that person, it wasn't going to do anything. They didn't care. And so it does. It destroys the vessel in which it's stored, not the one on which it's poured. Is just a little meme that I have running in my head from time to time, because there are times when it can become sinful.
Yeah.
What about the woman in Louisville who wrecked the Little Caesars over $1 charge for extra sauce?
Well, it made your point about expectations and anger really coming from having expectations that aren't met.
Yeah.
I would say not a reason to flip the table in my book.
No. What's interesting about that story? They've never named her.
And what's also interesting is I just wonder what else happened to her that day.
And that's kind of where I was going also at some point, that who knows what, again, she was already simmering. Why are you so close to a boil?
Right.
And what else has been going on in your life and in your day that you go into a Little Caesars, it's $1
Right.
charge for extra sauce, and you literally destroy the counter.
But I feel like something else
That's what I mean.
is
It's something else
going on.
had to be going on with her. So why do you think we get angry? I mean, I listed those two things. So let me just share what I listed, and you tell me what you'd add to it. The first reason I think, and this is just Sean thinking and researching, is our expectations aren't met. I get mad whenever I get disappointed, I become hurt, and then I become angry because I have this expectation. This is the way it's going to work, and it doesn't work this way. And I think that I get angry. I had somebody in the church say yesterday, I get angry when I'm embarrassed.
Oh, absolutely.
And so, isn't that interesting? So that was another one. And then the other I had was, I get angry when I love certain things way too much. I love me so much that if somebody says anything to me that hurts me about me, I get really angry with them. And that is what was the language I had? My love for myself is not properly ordered. Our loves are not properly ordered. And so, if I love blank and somebody does something to interfere with blank, I get extremely angry because I love blank. So what are some other reasons that you would add to why we get angry?
I think the expectations is a good one. I think that also kind of segues into our sense of justice, what we think is just and what isn't. Most of my anger, I think, stems from, but that's not fair. And, God doesn't promise us that life is fair.
It kind of promises us the opposite.
He does, but it's hard to remember it in the moment.
It is. Especially in the Old Testament, you've got all these Psalms where David is like, why are the wicked doing so well?
Yes.
And there's just this sense of, is God even paying attention? There's just no justice here.
But he continues to call to God. And so I think he still has that belief that in the end, things will be righted. Not necessarily in this lifetime, but maybe in the next. But I do love that he always goes back to still calling upon God for his help.
Yep. So he's talking about, why do we get angry? And he basically in verse 31, if you have your Bible, he says, hey, this is what destructive anger looks like. I alluded to this a second ago. Put away bitterness, wrath, wrangling, slander, and malice. And for me, this is a moment of kind of checking myself. Is the anger I am experiencing leading me to these things? So, I want to know, what does anger that becomes sin look like? Am I becoming bitter? Are my actions slanderous and malicious? In other words, because these are not the new person, the new lifestyle, the new humanity that Paul talks about. Slanderous and malicious.
Right. And on the point of slander, I wanted to go back to verse 29 because I love this, that he says, let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only what is useful for building up. I think, if we approach conversations as less of complaints and less of that malice and wrath and slander and approach it as, how can we find a solution? I think that's righteous.
Yeah.
Right. And it's hard to do. It's hard to ride that line. And I think it is misinterpreted quite a bit when someone is seeking a solution, but it sounds like slander. So that's a hard thing to do, but I think it's important.
Seems really practical to me.
It does.
Because, let it come out of your mouth. In other words, we control our speech. Our speech doesn't control us. And if we are open to God doing a work in our life, he talks about you're a new person, created according to God's likeness. We got to be careful with our speech.
Yes.
And I love what he says about not letting the sun go down on our anger too, because again, how often do we just sort of take all this to bed with us at night? And I mean, last night I did not sleep well. I've got to be out of town for a couple of days this week. I don't like that. I like being at my home. And I found myself thinking about things, an email that I read where I just didn't like this email.
Oh, no. Hopefully it wasn't one of mine.
It might have been.
What?
No, you might have forwarded it to me. I don't know. No, but I'm like, what am I doing?
Yeah.
I'm not going to solve this at 3:00 this morning.
Right.
I'm not going to solve it ever.
I do the same thing. But it's funny that you mentioned we have to be careful about our speech, what comes out of our mouth. I was watching something on social media today,
Okay.
but it was about how do we stop cursing as Christians? And
Yes, Jesse, how do we stop cursing
I
as
don't
a
know.
Christian?
I'm certainly not saying I have that issue.
I'm not either.
Some people who know me might disagree.
Not me.
In any event, what I liked is that the person was saying what you speak is coming out of your heart. And do you have a hardened heart or do you have a humble heart? And so I think that is a good way of looking at it and just the importance of our speech, like you were saying here.
What were you watching?
It was just an Instagram reel.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
From a author or
No,
theologian, a pastor?
No, I think it's kind of almost like a Charlie Kirk, if you will, but
Okay.
less political.
Uh-huh.
It was someone of that ilk.
Gotcha. Yeah, that is so important, I think, too, just to watch our speech. And I love what Paul writes, about building people up. And he says, give them grace in our speech. And, that's so hard sometimes.
That's so hard. Giving people grace, I think, is just, it's so hard.
Well, giving them grace is giving them a gift. This is yours. My kind words are yours.
Yeah. If you're angry, do you want to give someone that gift?
No.
Yeah. And so how do you get from that anger to giving that grace?
I think Paul would say, and again, he says it in verse 32, forgive them.
Right.
And as we've alluded to, I can't remember if it was just in a private conversation or on this podcast, forgiveness does not mean that we are in charge of pardoning their wrongs. That's not ours. That's not for you and me. That's not for us. And forgiveness doesn't even mean that we have to be reconciled. Sometimes reconciliation is just not possible. At least restoring a relationship to what it once was. The devotional that I read by Max Lucado, who's a really popular author, my mother actually sent that to me when I told her I was preaching out of Ephesians 4. She had read it a couple weeks ago. He basically writes, you don't have to pardon them. You don't have to be reconciled to them. You just have to say, I'm no longer going to seek to harm this person. I'm just going to try to be at peace with them.
Right.
So it's kind of an attitude shift.
Yeah. And I think that it's kind of similar to the Buddhist idea that if you can't help someone, just don't harm them. But I do also think that we're hearing from Paul and other authors in the Bible, because I looked it up. I was like, well, what does the Bible say about dispersing, getting rid of this anger? And it really is taking it to God and giving those concerns and worries up to God. And we kind of talked about that earlier with just knowing and feeling safe in the belief that God will handle that at whatever time he feels is appropriate. Usually not our time.
Probably
but
not.
Not on our time.
God has God's own timing.
Right. But I think that's powerful.
It is. Yeah. Just the notion that we can hand it over. If God can create the earth by speaking it into existence,
right,
certainly God can handle our emotions. So what else do you have? Anything? I think we've almost finished here at Walnut Hill.
I think we've covered a lot of you did mention Barry. I just have to throw
He was over yesterday.
I really want to meet Barry, and personally, I like him to come on one of our podcasts. He just sounds like an interesting character.
He's interesting. He's my nemesis.
No.
But the thing, I was in his backyard helping him with his lawnmower yesterday. We're friends, and he knows it. He's like, are you still mad at me? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe. I said, what have you done today? The other day, he had someone working in his yard, working on his house, and it was somebody who had actually done some work for us. And I just yelled over the fence, is there any way you could make this fence 25 feet tall between our houses? So we have a good time. But he is my nemesis. God's teaching me something through him.
I think so too.
Not sure what it is.
Patience? But I do find you to be fairly patient.
Most of the time. But yeah, we, used to be my dog Spot. Now it's my nemesis Barry. I've always got to have a nemesis, Jesse, in life.
Yeah, it's important.
Really.
But as long as Paul said you're passive about it, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to let the sun go down on that anger.
Yeah.
At least not so far.
Yep.
with what's happened.
Good.
There's always tomorrow. All right. Well, hey, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you, Jesse. Hope you have a wonderful week. And until next time, you take good care. Bye for now.
Thanks for joining us today on the Walnut Hill Podcast. We hope this conversation on anger and Paul's wisdom from Ephesians 4 spoke to your heart and gave you something to carry into your week. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to share it with a friend, leave a comment, or join us for worship here in Lexington on Sundays at 11 a.m. You can also join us online by going to our website at www.walnuthillchurchky.org and selecting Worship Now. Thanks for joining us.